One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey there, welcome back. We're in episode 81, still talking about obstacles to weight loss. And today's episode is probably going to bleed over into the next one as well, because it's a big topic and it's about gut health and your microbiome in the context of inflammatory drivers of difficult weight loss. And, it's every once in a while important to go back and remind ourselves of the big picture. Why are we even talking about these things? And certainly, fixing an unhealthy gut is important in and of itself. Who wants that? And certainly who wants all the consequences that can come from having, say, an infected, inflamed, and perhaps leaky gut. But today we're going to be talking about dysbiosis or dysbiotic overgrowth. And why don't we start just by, maybe defining a couple of terms. We'll do that a couple of times as we go through the episode today. And the first one is to talk about the word dysbiosis. It just means abnormal biotic environment. And biotics referring to, say, the balance of good as well as bad and perhaps even neutral bacteria in your gut. And we quite often use the word dysbiosis and infection interchangeably. And I guess technically they're a little bit different, but I think most of us these days are kind of using them as synonyms. Now, we could define an infection as something like getting something you should never have, like it shouldn't be there and now you have it, kind of like the flu or a cold or something like that. But with the gut's a little bit different, because in your gut you have things that are there all the time, even in healthy guts. And we'll come back to this point a couple of different instances. But you have things in your gut that, given an opportunity, will overgrow and become imbalanced and start to change how your gut is behaving. And so healthy guts have things in them that want to infect you. That's just the reality. And in the sense of overgrowing and taking control of the gut environment, so it's entirely possible. And I guess we need to speak a couple of general truths to begin with. And this is really just setting the mindset in giving a big picture framework for details to make sense. But it's entirely possible to have infections in your gut and actually not have any symptoms. And this is a mistake that not just healthcare consumers, people with complaints have, but even maybe poorly educated or naive clinicians look at somebody, maybe they do a symptom survey like I do with all of my new clients, my one-on-one coaching clients. And, maybe sometimes they have no symptoms at all in the section that asks questions that relate to gut health and gut function. And I can't just simply assume that because they answered no to all of my questions that there's not a gut infection. Because here's the truth. The most common infectious disease in the world is a gut infection called H. pylori or Helicobacter pylori. Now, there are different strains and different types of H. pylori. Some secrete toxins and some secrete different types of toxins, and some really don't secrete toxins. And so not every H. pylori infection is the same, but these infections are asymptomatic 80% of the time. And that means only 20% of the time can you expect to feel something in your gut that's not right if you have H. pylori. And current statistics are at any given moment, about half the world's population has H. pylori in the gut, and almost always it's asymptomatic. Now, a lot of docs won't treat H. pylori, and this is not a podcast episode about H. pylori, but it's just a convenient thing to talk about because we can talk about some general principles and some truths again. But a lot of docs won't treat silent H. pylori infections, and the thought is, well, if it's not causing problems, why put you on triple medication with antibiotics and proton pump inhibitors to get rid of it? Why, if it's not causing problems, just leave it alone? Well, the problem with that is that these silent H. pylori infections significantly increase over time. In the long run, significantly increase your chances for things like irritable bowel diseases, inflammatory bowel disorders, and even gastric carcinoma. And so, I would caution people that if you have a silent H. pylori infection, then you probably need to get it taken care of one way or another. It just so happens that the medical approach has a very high failure and recidivism rate, meaning you either can't get rid of it or you do, and it just comes right back. And that's typically because a medication-only approach really doesn't restore gut health, which is what you need in the long run to not get reinfected. But I digress. A lot of people will say the worst symptom of all is no symptom at all, because you don't know you have a problem. And then all of a sudden you're years down the road and you pay the piper for not having done things diligently to improve your health. So again, let's start with some truths. Not all gut infections create symptoms. Not all gut infections are things that you should never have. Again, we use the term dysbiosis and infection pretty much synonymously, but technically they are slightly different. But most gut infections are usually losing control over what's already there. Things like different strains of bacteria. H. pylori is one of them, one of many, or even candida or other fungal species, even, some low levels of even transient parasites. Like you might eat something that's got a parasite in it and it's there for a few days, and then your immune system beats it up, chews it up, spits it out, and you're done. And you don't have parasites, but you had a parasite for a time. So your gut system, your gut environment is very dynamic, it's very labile in different respects of using that word. Again, as a general rule, if other aspects of gut function are working fine, you're more likely to have low levels of imbalances in your gut, maybe some overgrowth, but not a lot, and generally have no symptoms whatsoever. And that's probably just the natural ebb and flow of a dynamic environment. But we can go even more big picture than this. And this is probably why we're going to end up spreading this discussion out over a couple of episodes, just so we can kind of compartmentalize concepts. And then I can, talk in a little bit of detail about each thing without trying to rush to get everything out in one 20-minute session. But the big picture is, I want to talk about the controlling influences over your gut health, because there are three things that exert the greatest influence over your gut and whether or not your gut does what it's supposed to do, which is not just about digesting and absorbing food and nutrients. But basically here what are the main things is that, number one, one of the greatest influences over your gut health is what's going on in the local gut environment. And that's what we'll talk about today, specifically about overgrowth of opportunistic commensal organisms and concurrent changes in your microbiome. But beyond that, what's going on in the local gut environment, your thyroid exerts a great influence over gut health. But perhaps more important than all of those is your brain. Specifically, and I know you guys have heard this, the vagus nerve, which is the output center for what we call your brain-gut axis. And there's actually a tremendous amount of research in and around that topic over the last decade or so. So we're going to talk about the first one today, which is the local gut environment. And again, we'll start by defining a few terms that I realized that I just used without defining. So, I suggested that part of this picture is the overgrowth of opportunistic commensal organisms. Like, what the heck does that mean? Well, I just shared with you that even healthy guts contain small amounts of potentially problematic organisms, things like H. pylori or Klebsiella is another common one, or staph or strep, or even, like the dreaded candida. And these are all commensal organisms. Commensal in the sense that under healthy conditions, they're present in a gut in low amounts. But as long as we have a healthy gut and healthy gut immune function, we keep them in check and we maintain control over what's happening from a biotic standpoint in the gut environment itself. Now, technically, the definition of a commensal organism is one where they derive benefit from us, but they don't give us benefit, and certainly they don't harm us. And so in one sense, we give these commensal organisms a nice, dark, warm, wet, nutrient-rich place to live, as long as they agree to not hurt us. These commensal organisms do nothing to help us, as far as we know right now. But as long as our gut is healthy and we control their population, they're okay. They're welcome to stay as long as they don't cause any issues or cause any problems. But given the opportunity, these otherwise neutral organisms will take advantage of a change in our gut situation and start to expand their population. They will multiply. And that can be a problem for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's usually associated with a decrease in our microbiota, the healthy things that do good things for us. And that's normally part of how we keep them under control, is by having a healthy probiotic environment, in the sense of having an abundance of healthy bacteria as well as a diversity of different species. And we'll talk about that briefly today. but also these opportunistic overgrowths of commensal organisms. Many of these organisms actually secrete different types of endotoxins or enterotoxins that, in very small amounts, coupled with a healthy immune system and a good microbiota that has a good, robust phase 1, phase 2 detoxification capacity, renders those low levels of toxins pretty much harmless. Even though they're there, there's not enough of them to really cause a problem. But as these commensal organisms take the opportunity to overgrow and become abundant, they secrete larger amounts of these toxins, and in the context of a less than healthy gut, will create issues. I mean, that's just the way it works. Now, in addition, common organisms, and I'll just give you examples because there's many others than what I want to mention right now, but organisms like staph or strep, again, very commonly found. Like, I don't find them in every stool test that I run on my clients, but a very large proportion. I would, off the top of my head, say probably approaching 80% of the stool tests I find show overgrowth of things like staph, strep, or Klebsiella. But some of these organisms can actually create issues with histamines. And you don't necessarily have to be someone who has like histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome to have a problem with histamines, either because the infections are secreting chemicals that encourage the activation of mast cells or otherwise change histamine production. Plus, on top of that, if we look at the spectrum of organisms that are commonly found in people with gut complaints, and I understand I said a lot of times you have these infections and you don't have symptoms, and that's actually not a bad deal. It still needs to be dealt with, but most people do have complaints. But some of these organisms tend to be found on biopsies of the small intestine contents in studies done on things like SIBO or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is in large part responsible for creating things like irritable bowel syndrome. Now, one word of caution, if you have heard the word SIBO, especially in context of IBS, and maybe you think or you know that you have it, I don't want you to think that you can diagnose SIBO with a stool test. You can't. There is a test for SIBO that's a breath test, hydrogen methane breath test, but we don't typically recommend doing it, and I certainly don't order it. I think it's a waste of money because it's wrong half the time. It's one of those situations where if it's positive, you can trust it, but if it's negative, you can't. And why run the risk of wasting a few $100s if you can get equally or probably even better, more valid, reliable, consistent, reproducible results by doing some kind of a diet elimination and reintroduction to tell whether or not you have SIBO. And again, I don't want to turn this into a SIBO conversation, which is quite easy to do because of how prevalent it is. But nevertheless, let me just kind of refocus. We're talking about, what does it mean to have an opportunistic commensal overgrowth? Well, again, commensal organisms live in our gut. We give them a place to stay as long as they agree to not hurt us. They don't do anything good for us, but they don't hurt us either unless we lose control of their population and they start to multiply. And as they become more abundant, they tip the balance between, say, good and bad, and in many cases secrete different types of compounds and toxins that do bad things. And this is where a lot of the symptoms do come from when we have someone with a symptomatic gut infection. So, it's bad enough to have an overgrowth of things that normally don't hurt us, and all of a sudden now they're complicating matters in the gut. But if that's paired with a change in our probiotic environment, then we really start to run into problems because, again, naturally, having abundant and diverse microbiome, I should say technically microbiota, the good healthy portion of your microbiome, that is how we keep the potentially unfriendly, problematic population under control, basically doing what we want, which is nothing. And so a key difference between a commensal organism and a probiotic organism is that while a controlled commensal doesn't hurt us, a loss of probiotic species almost always is coupled with a loss of the positive things that these probiotics should be doing for us. And so we kind of get a double whammy. We get an overgrowth of neutral things that becomes negative, and then we get a loss of things that should be doing positive things, and we lose that positive influence. So in essence, commensals shouldn't hurt us, but often do when they overgrow, and probiotics should help us and often don't when they're reduced in their population. And in a little twist, yes, sometimes you can have too much of a good thing, and that can be a problem. There are some probiotic species that might become overgrown in these dysbiotic conditions, and that can contribute to poor gut health as well. So yeah, you can have too much of a good thing. And this is a fairly recent, I guess, realization. 2 years ago, I would have told you that we don't know about any negative side effects of having too many probiotics. Well, now we're starting to see the studies come out that confirm, yeah, certain species of normal, healthy probiotics can cause problems if they're overabundant. So to translate that into something very easy to understand is that gut health is quite often about balance, not having too much of what could harm us and having just enough of the good stuff that contributes to our well-being. So one way we can get into a dysbiotic overgrowth of these commensals is by losing our probiotic population. And probably the most common thing people think of is like, if I take an antibiotic designed to kill bacterial infections, I'm probably going to lose the bacteria in my gut that help me, at least to a certain degree. And there is a lot of truth to that. But you can have dysbiotic overgrowth just by having a standard American diet. Now, another way to contribute to dysbiotic overgrowth of these commensal organisms is by reduced digestive capacity. When we think of things like stomach acid or pancreatic enzymes, we tend to think of our ability to digest proteins and fats and carbohydrates. And of course, that is a key role. And also, but it's not uncommon to see people with gut infections that also complain of a wide range of maldigestion symptoms, but not our focus today. But our ability to break down proteins and carbs, particularly, is also tied to the potential for overgrowth. And this dovetails in several different ways with a discussion about the microbiome. In the world of probiotics, there are certain species that feed better off things like amino acids from proteins, and there are other species, actually the bulk of them, that feed off starches and sugars and fibers. So in your microbiome, your microbiota, again to be technical, in your probiotic environment, you have, let's call it, protein-consuming species, and you have carbohydrate-consuming species. And we need to have a balance of both of those. And so it turns out that the standard American diet is less than optimal, or it is a less than optimal way to get and to keep a healthy gut because of its overemphasis on carbohydrates, unhealthy fats, and unfortunately increasingly lower, I don't even know how to say it, an increasingly lower amount of healthy protein intake with everything that's going on in the world, trying to push everyone into veganism and plant-based foods. Now, in one sense, your microbiome is very dynamic and very responsive, right? Studies show that you can shift your microbiome, at least begin to see the changes one way or another, favorably or unfavorably, within 3 days of a diet change. That's pretty impressive in terms of how powerful your diet can be in helping your gut. But in another sense, your microbiome is a little stiff. It has a memory, if you will, a set point, as we've talked about with the hypothalamic set point. And much like the discussion we had on the hypothalamic set point, where your brain wants to keep you at a higher body weight, your microbiome will tend to drift back to its set point if you're not doing things to maintain a different profile of your probiotic species. And basically, the set point is going to be a different profile or a certain profile of protein and carbohydrate consuming species, which may or may not be favorable to you. Now, do you know how that set point is determined? Well, there's 3 main influences that do that. Number 1 is whether or not you were born vaginally or born through C-section. Second one is whether or not you were breastfed, and if so, for how long before you went, say, bottle fed. And the final would be any use of broad spectrum antibiotics in infancy and in the toddler years, like the first several years, like how you were born, how you were breastfed, how long you were breastfed, and your interaction with broad spectrum antibiotics all determine that profile that your microbiome wants to go back to. And again, this is elucidated in the scientific literature. So in essence, this aspect of your health history sets the stage for your microbiome, such that people who were born C-section were not breastfed at all or not for very long, and were given antibiotics at an early age, quite often for recurrent ear infections. That's a very common one. Those three things together, these people will tend to struggle with their microbiome unless they're doing very specific things in adulthood to maintain a healthy balance. And I'm not talking about just taking probiotics, because to be honest, I don't think that's the best long-term strategy anyways. I think it'd be quite advantageous in the short term, but it should be a short-term tool, and you shouldn't have to rely on probiotics to help stay or keep a healthy gut in the long run. But people who didn't have the greatest promoting start to life, right? They were C-section, they weren't breastfed, they used antibiotics when they were babies. That tends to set them up for a lifelong struggle with gut health. And because most of these dysbiotic conditions, with or without maldigestion, drive some degree of inflammation and obesity, and there's a lot of research that connects those two, that then promotes unhealthy fat cell behavior. And I'll just remind you about the last conversation we had talking about different types of fat cells and what happens when your fat mass gets inflamed for any reason, one of which could be dysbiotic overgrowth, infections in your gut. And so a lot of times when, let me say it this way, in an ideal world, babies would be born naturally, they would be breastfed for an adequate period of time and never go on antibiotics. That would be ideal. And when they transition to solid food, they would eventually adopt a diet that had adequate animal proteins in it, because that is by far the most nutritious protein that we have, protein sources, to give us amino acids that can be utilized by the microbiome, as well as a diversity of plant fibers and starches to feed the microbiome and to keep it balanced and healthy. But sadly, such is not the case. And, maybe in that description, in that discussion about how your microbiome set point begins, maybe you see yourself in that. Maybe you don't. And that's okay. Just at least now you know to think, well, maybe this is a problem for me. And maybe it's part of why my gut's never sorted out, or it always goes back after I do something favorable. Now, finally, on the topic of the local gut environment, this will be the last topic. And we're talking again, local gut environment as a determinant of gut health, as a determinant of inflammation and hence difficult weight loss. We have to talk about something called biofilm. Now, 10 years ago or so, when I started sharing what I had learned myself by reading the medical literature, what I had learned about biofilm, when I was teaching seminars and I started asking docs, like, who here has heard of biofilm? Like nobody, and I mean nobody, put their hands up. I mean, it was like a brand new, I'm sure I'm not the first person to bring it into the functional medicine space, but if not, I was one of the first ones. And I started sharing this, and now, like, I was just in San Francisco teaching a seminar over the weekend, and I asked the question, we got to a section on gut health and how that impacts hormones. And I asked the question, who here has heard of biofilm? And about half of the group, and there's about 45 docs there, about half the group put their hands up. And that's way better than 10 years ago, but still it's not, I mean, I'm looking for the point where I ask the question and everyone's like, yeah, we all know about it. We all know how to deal with it. So let's move on to something else. That's the point that I'm looking for, but it'll take a while for us to get there. So let me explain what biofilm is. First of all, it occurs in nature. I mean, if you're out hiking in the woods and you come across a stream and you see all that green, shiny stuff on the rocks or maybe on the top of the water, that's biofilm. In fact, the first scientists to discover biofilm was in the field of dental research. In fact, dental plaque is biofilm. So it happens in nature outside. It happens inside our body just kind of as a natural course. But as it relates to the gut, what ends up happening is, these commensal organisms are in your gut and they can attach themselves to the intestinal lining, like the wall of your intestine. And quite literally, and this gets a little bit freaky and like science fiction-y, they send out these chemical invitations to other organisms to come join them. And so we get a congregation of different species, bacteria, and so on, all kind of connected together in one spot, colluding to protect themselves. And in essence, what they do is they collude together to secrete this gooey polysaccharide matrix called biofilm, in which they live. And the advantage to them is that they're able to evade detection by your own immune system. So it's a survival mechanism for them, but it also protects them against things like antibiotics. And this is one of the reasons why we have antibiotic resistant strains. Part of it is because of this biofilm formation and phenomena. Now, statistically, and the numbers vary just depending on which papers you read, eventually I'm sure we'll get to kind of an average and a consensus, but I've read papers anywhere from 40 to 80% of gut infections involve biofilm formation. And unfortunately, while we might have a lab that can do biofilm assessment for things like fluid drawn off, like in a swollen knee, for example, we don't have a lab yet that will look at a stool sample and tell us if there's biofilm in the stool. So we have limited testing. And it's one of those frustrating things for me as a clinician where we see all this research about this thing, but there's no way to test for it. So we just have to go with the statistics and the probability. We just better assume if someone has a commensal overgrowth and a dysbiotic infection, then let's just assume biofilm is part of that scenario. And why is it important? Because you'll never get rid of the infection until you dissolve or break open the biofilm. Now, antibiotics can do that, but the studies show that you have to prescribe them in doses that are 1,000 times what you would normally take to get rid of a bacterial infection with a cough or a chest infection. And so that's not going to work. No one's going to prescribe antibiotics at that strength. And, the impact on your microbiome is going to be untenable at that point. So what we're left with is natural medicine, and it's great. And again, this is not just a talk about biofilm, and I'm thinking I might have to do a mini series just on biofilm itself, just because there's so much more research now than there was 10 years ago. But nevertheless, there's no shortage of specific enzymes or other herbal compounds that can break down the biofilm so that we can get access to the critters that are causing the infection and the ones that are difficult to get rid of. And that's all part of, having not only just a good diagnostic approach to figure out, are you infected, and if so, with what, and how does that translate into your individual experience, but also to have strategies not just to support digestion, but to break open biofilm to get rid of the infection so that they stay gone. So not only does biofilm prevent us from seeing and dealing with the gut infections, the biofilm itself, and this is fairly recent, in terms of research and literature, the biofilm itself acts as a single living organism that, you guessed it, promotes more inflammation. And so if you are someone who struggles with weight loss and calorie restriction and exercise hasn't done it, and maybe you've checked your thyroid, maybe you've checked your adrenals, and maybe you've made some changes and stabilized your insulin and your blood sugar, but you haven't thought to look at your gut because maybe you don't have any gut symptoms. And maybe you don't have symptoms because you literally have an asymptomatic dysbiotic overgrowth, but you still have a dysbiotic overgrowth. Or maybe you don't have symptoms because you've kind of modeled your diet and your lifestyle around your gut so you don't do the things that would trigger symptoms. So that's very common as well. So knowing if you're infected is a big deal. Don't rely on symptoms or the absence thereof. And the best thing is, ideally to work with someone who can order proper lab testing for you from a lab that specializes in stool testing for this purpose. Unfortunately, the tests that you'll get through the medical community, through standard labs like Quest and LabCorp, they usually will only order 4 or 5 organisms that are known to cause like acute diarrhea. And if you don't have those, they're like, well, no, you have no infections. Well, that's not true. All they can say is you don't have the things that they tested for. They can't say you're not infected because they only tested for 5 things, but there are dozens, if not hundreds of things that can cause this dysbiosis. And unless you have the proper testing, you're not going to find it. And in that sense, and I'll just throw out a couple of lab names and test names that I would consider to kind of be at the top of their game. There's a lot of labs out there that are happy to take your money and create some kind of a report, but technology has changed a lot in the last decade for sure. So the 2 labs that I tend to prefer, one is Genova Diagnostics. They've been around. They're probably the largest. No, they are the largest functional medicine testing group in the world, and they have an international presence. And they have a test called GI-Effects, EFFECTS, GI-Effects, which I will typically use if I don't have access to my preference. And my preference is a test called the GI Map from a lab called Diagnostic Solutions Lab. And the GI Map, I like it because it's everybody knows what this is now. It's a PCR-based test, especially with coronavirus and all the molecular testing that's going on. Basically, it uses the same technology that they use to track viral loads in, say, people with hepatitis, or to see whether or not you've been exposed to coronavirus. And so literally it's looking for DNA. And when you find it, you know that the organism is there. And it's a lot more sensitive than a lab tech looking through a microscope onto a stool sample to see if there's anything wiggling around there. Maybe I didn't need to describe it that way, but in essence, that's pretty much what they do. And obviously, once you know that you're infected, you can either try to do stuff yourself, figure it out on your own, or go work with someone. Not all stool or gut infections are created equal in the sense of what works for one person doesn't always work for somebody else. And so ideally, you'd want something that's personalized. So listen, every once in a while, I'll toot my own horn and promote my own work. I'd be happy if you want to reach out and talk to me and see if working together one-on-one would make sense. That's just as easy as reaching out. You can do it through my website. You can send an email to podcast@drnoseworthy.com. Or you just go to my website, drnoseworthy.com. There's a contact form there. Or if you're the type that kind of likes to do things on your own, then you might want to check out the 5-step gut protocol that I created a couple of months ago. You can find it on my website. Just go to the main page, look up the top menu on the right-hand side. It says DIY or do-it-yourself courses. Click on that, and you'll see the courses that I've created for people who just want to spend a little bit of money, but kind of use a lot of self-direction. And these programs are actually very information intensive. I mean, you think maybe I put a lot of information in this podcast? Wait until you see my online programs. Sometimes it's information overload, but it's coupled with like video lectures and PowerPoint slides and PDFs and assessments and all different kinds of things. And, these things are very affordable. And if you're the type that likes to figure stuff out on your own, that might be the best. And what I'll do is I'll put a link to the 5-step gut protocol in the description of this particular episode. If you just want to click on that, that'll take you right to it. All right, so that's it for the dysbiosis and the gut portion of different obstacles to weight loss. Next time we're back, it's going to be about detoxification and obesogens and endocrine disruptors. But I will tell you, today is Sunday. Tomorrow I'm heading out into the woods to go camping with my father for about a week. And so I'll be out of pocket, and it might be about a week before I get another episode up. But hang out there. It'll be coming. I'm not going anywhere. I'm just taking a little time off to go hang out with my father. All right, guys, take care. We'll talk to you again soon here on the Inflammation Nation. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com. That's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.